All right, let's go ahead and get started so we don't get farther behind. Just drone.
Stole my joke.
I hate it when that happens. So, Mr. Peterson, do I have noise? Thank you. Well, good morning. We're going to go ahead and keep going. You really don't want the retired Marine to come out of the grave. It's not pretty, okay?
I think he's there.
Well, thanks, Doc. Well, it's hard to beat pavement design for, exciting stuff, but let me say, first of all, that I am not Scotty Malta. And I promised I would not do anything to embarrass him. So if I do, just remember that my name is not Rod Probst, and I am not the Deputy Director for Airports for the City of San Diego. I'm Scotty Malta. So we're going to talk about drones. We're very fortunate to have an expert on the subject, Dr. Greg McNeal. As I read his bio, I was stunned to see that he is not only a PhD, but he's a Juris Doctorate, and he's an expert on drones. So enough of Scotty's babbling. Greg, thank you.
Appreciate it. It's funny you say he's into drones, has a law degree and a PhD, which means that nobody likes me, right? Because, those are like three categories. Oh, not everyone loves drones. I sort of love drones, but sort of don't. I think airport people are kind of like my kinfolk, and I feel like I have mixed feelings about drones, despite the fact being a co-founder of a drone company where drones need to be successful for my company to be successful, but a necessary precondition, sort of in my worldview, for drones to be successful is for them to be welcomed and accepted into society, and that requires sort of a baseline level of safety. And so I joke about drones largely because I'm a drone proponent, but within sort of a bounding box that I think makes sense to all of us. So today's presentation, I was given a lot of room to run, and I'm just gonna kind of riff on a bunch of different themes that I think are important to give you just a sense of where things are from a technology company perspective. So when I look at the world of drones, I have a time horizon on this that I think might be very different than your time horizon. And especially if you're involved in the day-to-day work that you're involved in, every once in a while you kind of have to pop up from where you're at, look over the horizon and see what's coming. And there's a lot coming. There's a lot of innovation happening. There's a substantial amount of capital being put into the drone marketplace, pushing drone innovations. And there's a fairly aggressive regulatory timeline at the FAA that really has us driving towards full integration of drones into the NAS around 2020, if the FAA hits their timelines. And so that's a big question as to whether or not they'll hit their timelines. So let me just kind of hop into things, and then hopefully we'll have a little bit of opportunity for Q&A as we get further in. So just a sense of the scale. Today we're looking at 770,000 plus drones that were registered with the FAA. There was a recent ruling overturning the FAA's registration activity. I think that's just going to get reversed. That's just a bump along the way. This number's actually higher now. I just learned this morning that it's higher than 32,000 Part 107 pilots. It's trending closer to 50,000 Part 107 operators. So that's actually, I think, a pretty good indicator. That means there are 50,000 people out there who were willing to take an aeronautical knowledge test before deciding to operate a drone. They got themselves a Part 107 remote pilot certificate. I did it on the first day that I could do it up at Todd's Airport. I did it up in Ventura County Airports area. I can't remember what the name of the testing facility was, but did it right there on the airport. Give you an idea of kind of the future, why there's so much money going into this space, and why that matters for you. The projections, they're all over the place, but one of the high numbers we've seen, $127 billion of economic impact, 100,000 jobs, right? So drones are important, and I think that my central thesis here is that airports are going to be critically important in the future of drones, and particularly our smaller airports our non-towered airports actually, I think, have a whole opportunity for a new renaissance in aviation for a variety of reasons, being closer into population centers that haven't been traditionally served by logistics, by having the opportunity to perhaps pivot to focus on drones. They have less manned air traffic oftentimes, so they're perfect for aeronautical activity, especially if you're thinking that drones not only includes sort of the things we think of today, remote control sort of aircraft, but instead you start to think about autonomous flying vehicles on which people are carried, right? Call that a flying car or whatever the heck Airbus calls it. And so I think there's just a lot of opportunity here for us if we think creatively about the long term. And so this is familiar to many of you, but an idea of the evolution of the drone economy started off, when I started back in my career looking at this, going back all the way, even before 2006, actually, I was focused on drones and their military applications because I had been an Army officer, and I focused a lot on national security related issues. I did some counterterrorism work, and drones were sort of the hot thing. And I found myself going to all these different conferences, the AUVSI conference and others. And each year that I went to the conference, it was about military, and then there was a little bit of commercial, and then a little bit more. And then this year it was, you walked the floors at the drone conference, and it was 2/3 about commercial opportunities and maybe 1/3 about military applications, to the point where the military applications sort of have to have their own separate defense-oriented convention. So that kind of gives you the leading edge sort of indicator of what's to come. We're now seeing in our company enterprise uses of drones. So, Part 107 certificates have been around for about a year, a little less than a year. You could be this remote pilot, one operator, one aircraft. We're now seeing one operator managing multiple operators, and eventually the plan would be one operator managing multiple drones. And so that's where the real value starts to take off, when you can start to eliminate individual operators and get the value of an aerial perspective on whatever your job is, but starting to cut out individual operators and managing multiple drones in the sky, and then eventually really supervising autonomous missions. And that's also where we'll start to see the infrastructure component coming into play, where drones will be not only part of inspecting infrastructure, for example, that's what we think of now, but drones will actually start to become part of the way we think of infrastructure, in particular transportation infrastructure or other forms of infrastructure where we're trying to gather knowledge. And so you can see where many believe, Airbus is one principal example of that you can look in the lower right-hand corner there, that some forms of surface transportation will be replaced by technology that's fundamentally premised upon the drone technology that we see today, either in military applications or in commercial applications. And for that to happen, we'll need an infrastructure to ensure that that's supported. And so this is kind of what it looks like today. Almost all of these aspects are represented in some respect. Filming, monitoring, inspection, communication, security. The one that's sort of limited is the moving stuff, the logistics applications. But all of this, the goal is to take this small sliver, this indicator of what's happening, and industry wants to make this happen at scale, right? So 10x, 100x the number of operations that you're presently seeing today. At Airmap, we see about 100,000 daily operations. Give you an idea of the sense of the number of flights that are occurring on a daily basis, just that we're privy to. The moving stuff is largely a regulatory barrier right now to being able to deliver things or to move items, and we expect that that's going to be changing. Even this year, just under Part 107, there are proposed changes in Congress. Not that I believe that Congress is going to do anything other than an extension this year, but if Congress were to do something, you might see tweaks to the Part 107 regulations that will allow 107 operators operating within line of sight to be able to deliver goods. Now, that might not sound like something that's that useful, but if you are on one side of an open pit mine and you need to get some stuff to the other side of the mine, all of a sudden that does start to become something useful. And when you combine it with other more complex operations, nighttime operations, operations that are limited beyond visual line of sight, so just temporarily passing behind a building to get to somewhere, a little bit of autonomy added into that, and you can start to see that there's some value that comes with those types of operations. So these are some estimates. In 2012, the estimate was that in 2020, there's an FAA estimate that in 2012, we would see, by 2020, 30,000 drones operating in the United States, right? And so that was when Congress passed the FAA Modernization and Reform Act, the best prediction at the time was that we'd see 30,000 drones 3 years from today. And so that prediction was somewhat off. In 2014, the prediction was 500,000 drones that we would see. I'm sorry, so by 2014, we saw 500,000 drones in the United States. There's an estimate that we saw of 2.5 million drones sold in 2016, and an estimate that we'll have 7 million drones sold in 2020. The sort of takeaway is that our predictions on this have been pretty much off. Now, there's a little bit of fuzziness in these numbers, though. Like I have a drone, I have a couple drones, and maybe I fly them I have like 7 drones, but I think I fly one of them maybe once or twice a month. And so the utilization rates are a big question. You know, the sales numbers are one thing. How often these are being used is another question. I actually think the best indicator of usage is to look at the number of commercial operators, because if you're willing to go take that test, you have some commercial, you're probably going to begin to start operating and operating on a regularized basis. Okay, so kind of transitioning here, one thing that we believe deeply in at Airmap is that data will really decide the future of drones. That if you believe that drones need to be able to operate autonomously beyond line of sight, they're going to actually need to understand something about the world around them to be able to do that. So you can trace this sort of circuitous route through a comic-like city where, you know, the aircraft might be taking off. You can see in the lower left-hand corner at let's say an airport that maybe was only previously having 1 to 2 flights a day, a couple Cessnas landing, and all of a sudden someone got the idea that, you know what, we're perfectly located adjacent to these high population centers. We have hangars, we have maintenance areas, we have all the infrastructure necessary to do high-scale drone operations or flying car operations. And so situated right there, close to the city, and then the question becomes sort of what types of things does the drone need to know to be able to get from that airport deeper into the city? And you can see the awareness about fires. Now, in the manned aviation world, we think, well, if there's a fire, I'll learn about that through a temporary flight restriction. Anyone who's had to deal with trying to get a TFR up with the FAA knows that it takes a little bit of time. And so a drone that is operated below 400 feet, right? So by regulation, it will necessarily need to be within 400 feet of the ground or a structure if it's going higher than that, will likely never, the FAA will likely never know about the local structure fire or the local first responder activity. And so it's a new data source that somehow is going to have to be surfaced and provided. And you can see that sort of localized fire there that might not be a wildfire. What about the flight over a crowded area, right? You see the children's park there, but what if that's the county fair? And it was a perfectly great place to fly right up until the Ferris wheel went up this morning, and now all of a sudden it's not a great place to fly. You'll either need some sense and avoid technology to be able to avoid that, or ideally you would know about it ahead of time so that your drone could route you around that. You can just kind of see the difference then in the nature and character of the community, where I think actually airport people have a good way of thinking about this. So if you think about a drone here navigating through, let's say that's a commercial district up top, but then making the turn and heading through the residential district, we might be okay with the part in the top having drone operations taking place 24/7. It's a commercial district, maybe, let's say if there's a warehouse district, but do we want 24/7 operations taking place in residential neighborhoods, right? Sounds great for me if I can get a burrito at 3 a.m. It doesn't sound great for me if I'm trying to get my 9-month-old to go to sleep and my neighbor gets a burrito at 3 a.m., right? And so everybody wants what they want for themselves, but not necessarily what they want for others. Can the FAA scale to be able to handle that type of issue? Our thesis, just to be very clear about that, is that we don't think that the FAA will be able to handle those types of noise issues that would happen throughout communities where entire communities are converted into airports. I would much rather have state aeronautics, state aviation officials delegating that authority to county aviation officials who are going to make decisions with their local officials about the places within communities that make sense. Standardize the communication of the information, create a standard data exchange format for it, but it's really a delegated way of approaching this issue. If my theory is correct that a delegation might be the best way to do this, we might see a renaissance in aviation like we've never seen before, where state aeronautics directors are now rising in sort of stature on a level akin to state DOT officials. And those county officials now are going to be able to act quickly to promote aviation, to promote innovation, to be responsive to the needs of their communities, all operating within a bounding box that might be set by the FAA with regard to setting standards. But when it comes to things like the time, the manner, and the place of the operation, we're going to trust local officials, whether they're at airports or whether they're at the county or at the state level. And I think states might be the best place to start to decide that. This is the type of thing that when I mention this at NASEO, they get very excited because they always want to tell you about their history of promoting aviation and unifying aeronautical law across the country dating back to the 1930s. But actually, when you read that kind of thing, you start to realize that the issues that we faced back in the 30s as a country were largely about intrastate aircraft flights at low altitudes. And only when we started to realize that the flights were becoming more interstate did we push more things up to the federal government. Well, now that paradigm's been sort of flipped on its head. This data is all contained locally. It's data that's adjacent to airports. It's data that's embedded in communities. It's information and concerns that are of local nature. And maybe that means that we're going to have a new paradigm by which we figure this out. This is all the subject of like hot debate at the FAA and in DC right now. And so this is just an example of the way Airmap looks at the world right now, which looks a lot like sort of an aeronautical chart. One thing I want to flag for you, though, is this in the upper right-hand corner here. So you'll see this is the controlled airspace around around El Monte Airport, and then you'll see these boxed grid areas. This is what the FAA's new LANCE program looks like, where they basically carved up the airspace around airports, and they plan to do this around all airports with controlled airspace. And each of those grids represents a certain altitude level at which the operation of the drone will eventually be automatically approved by technology service providers. And so the FAA is going to, instead of being in the role of approving on a case-by-case basis in a manual way whether or not aircraft can operate in controlled airspace, they are instead delegating this to right now 12 companies who will have this data, and then what a drone operator will do is they will file a request for authorization adjacent to that airport. The data will hit the private company's servers. Airmap is one of those companies. We will immediately then respond to the operator based on the location where you plan to operate. Your operation is either approved or disapproved, and we're doing that through a delegation on behalf of the FAA. That flight is then logged and made known to air traffic controllers. If there's a notice requirement, that notice can be provided to airports as well. And so the system is all designed to be automated to handle the scale. One of the things we're hearing out of the FAA is thought that if this is successful, then a similar mechanism of notice or authorization might happen for flights that take place in particularly sensitive areas in communities away from airports. And so that might be operations near critical infrastructure, or operations over places that a city or county designates as particularly sensitive. And this would be just for drones. It wouldn't affect manned aviation. Manned aviation would be separated from this. But the idea is to recognize that if we're going to get to that scale of millions of drone operations like we talked about, we're going to need a new way of thinking about how we approach managing air traffic. Just to give you a little data point, Amazon and Google both predict that if their drone package delivery operations will be successful, they'll require anywhere from 100,000 to 150,000 daily operations over a city like Los Angeles. And so You're talking 3x the number of manned air traffic, I think, that happens on a daily basis, centered over just one city. That sounds great, but I think the people in the city of Los Angeles and various communities are going to want to have some say about that volume and scale of activity, the where and the when. The best example somebody gave me was, and this is fun because we're in Orange County, imagine you have this like 4th floor condo overlooking the ocean in Orange County, like in Newport or something. And then all of a sudden, algorithmically, Amazon and Google have decided that the 4th floor, that altitude is the most ideal route by which to route their drones, right? And so now you've been looking at the ocean every day, and now every 15 minutes, vroom, vroom, right? And so your 4th floor condo that was worth more than the 1st floor condo now all of a sudden is worth something different. It's the same thing we see when FAA changes routes and makes them more accurate. All of a sudden coming over one community is disproportionately burdened by those overflights, and it's a big sort of scandalous thing where we all start screaming at the FAA. Well, now do that in Newport Beach, and do it in Redondo, and do it in Manhattan Beach, and then ask yourself, who's the poor schlub at the FAA that's going to deal with that? No way are they going to deal with that. They're going to delegate to one of you poor schlubs. And so even more complex when we get into urban environments, right? But you kind of get the theme here where the operation now is adjacent to certain floors of the building. You have microscale wind, you have other dangerous or hazardous conditions, and so it's not just, though, about safety, it's also about the character of the community. I think people with the skill sets that the people in this room have a way of thinking about this that's going to be critically important for the future, because you understand how your airports impact the communities that you're adjacent to. You'll start to understand this as well when every place in a community becomes an airport. The mayor of San Francisco said this at a recent Drone Advisory Committee meeting, as did Administrator Huerta. Administrator Huerta said, we've basically converted entire cities into airports because drones can take off and land from almost anywhere, and that will necessitate a new way for us to think about things. I think you have the right way of thinking about that, and how might we export that knowledge into adjacent communities while also maintaining the core competencies that you have at your own facilities, and making those facilities not only valuable for today, but also valuable for the future. Talked already about the data point around fires and the types of fires that come up that we don't know about, first responder activity, the local farmers market. I think I had one on here. It's a great example, right? Like, it's a perfect place to fly, except for like every other Thursday, when all of a sudden there's a farmers market here and a large gathering of people. The really interesting example, someone actually in Orange County, sheriff's deputy brought this example up to me. He said he showed up at a park. It was a Saturday morning, and there was a guy flying his drone there. And the person had a Part 107 certificate. His drone was registered, and it was 9 in the morning, and he said he was not going to be done with his flight until 9:20. No regulation in this city that prevents drones or aircraft from operating in that location. Problem, though, the kids' soccer game was supposed to start at 9 o'clock, and this guy wanted to map that field, and it was going to take him 20 minutes to complete his operation. So his statement was, I'm here first. I'm in the National Airspace System. You have no authority to tell me what to do in the National Airspace System, because it is a public navigable highway through which I have the right to operate, so long as I have my Part 107 certificate and I'm registered, which I am. I guess everybody's going to have to wait 20 minutes until I'm done. I was there first, right? Yeah. So how did the sheriff's deputy handle it? Anybody know? He said, well, yeah, you're right. I can't do anything about your drone that's in the National Airspace System, but you're standing on Orange County land, and you've got a problem. And so he basically told him, you're going to land the thing, or I'm gonna pull you away and put you in the back of the patrol car. And if you're in the back of the patrol car, you're not going to be able to fly that thing anymore, which sounds like you're going to be careless or reckless, and then you're going to be endangering the lives of the children. So we can play this thing out the way you want to play it out, or you can just land now and do your little mapping thing at another time so that these kids can get on with their soccer game. But you could see like some like cute like jailhouse lawyer like sort of Part 107 operator teeing up the conflict that we're going to see sort of coming up around these things if we don't have state and local officials have a bit more of a voice as to time, manner, and place. A few more things just to kind of give you data points as we think about this. So today, the drone operator needs to know about the fire and whether or not they're flying over a building that has a glass roof, because if you have to ditch somewhere, much better ditch into the concrete roof than into the glass roof. All of that is something that a person could figure out today. What happens when the drone is operating autonomously? It has to have some awareness around this. First of all, just for routing, if I'm going to route and the most efficient route is to go over the concrete roof and then up this way as opposed to over the glass roof, I might just as a matter of risk decide that the risk minimizing route is to go over the concrete roof instead of over the glass roof, even if that might cost me an extra second, because the aggregation of all of my flights over time might suggest to me, or my insurer might care about me taking risk minimizing routes. Going over the roadway instead of going over the beach where there are unprotected persons. These are all kinds of questions that, that we wouldn't normally think about in manned aviation, but when we think about unmanned aviation and autonomous unmanned aviation, we might want to start to think about. This is on top, this is risk stuff on top of the noise and nuisance issues that we talked about before. So the future here is a system known as unmanned traffic management. You might have heard about this as a NASA project. It is closer than you think. LANCE, the program that I just told you about for notice and authorization to airports, rolls out this October in a pilot program and launches for real in February. LANCE is stage 1 of unmanned traffic management. So NASA's view on unmanned traffic management, stage 1 is let us know where you're operating and request authorization. Stage 2 after that is let us know not only where you're presently operating, but where you intend to operate, and let us know as you're operating real-time telemetry. So how do we marry up real-time telemetry with the idea of filing a digital flight plan? I'm on the FAA's Remote Identification Aviation Rulemaking Committee. It's going to be a combination of something that either looks like it's going to be a performance standard, like drone must be identifiable at X distance, and the mechanism by which you can achieve that might be ADS-B or some other form of RF, or it might be LTE, and that information right now might be communicated into a network. We're still kind of having a discussion about what exactly it will look like, and so I'm just framing up what the proposed papers were without giving you any inside info into where we're at. But by September 30th, we'll have a published recommendation which will create a performance standard for remote identification of drones. Once that happens, the flight notice and authorization then expands to a flight plan, which then also has real-time information about where the drone is operated. And all of a sudden, we all start to have digital awareness of where the drones are, and they can start separating from one another. So that's on the roadmap, and that's, what's it, 17 now? First quarter of 2018, you'll see LANCE really rolling out in greater fashion. Through 18, we'll continue to incrementally improve as the regulations are proposed through 18 and 19, ultimately with the BV loss regulations being finalized around 2020. That's the plan. So as you look at your planning and budget cycles, I mean, I don't know if you're on a 1, 2, or 3 year cycle, but as you start to look forward to the future, this future is very close. What impact it'll have on you, I think, is really subject to your own determination. I did have one person at FAA and another person in Congress tell me that there was a recent change to AIP grant eligibility where digital infrastructure type things is grant eligible. And so software services, these types of things, where if you decide that you're an airport that wants to get ahead of this, and I've met someone at an airport in New Jersey who they basically want to just turn the whole airport into a drone port. There are opportunities for you to plan and think creatively about how to become a participant in this future. And again, this future represents a really new way of thinking about rising technology. For us, we think about it as collaborative acceleration, where we work with the FAA or we work with airports to make things happen more quickly. And I think airports can center themselves in this to also make things happen much more quickly, ultimately leading to package delivery drones. But really, the big future where there's a ton of money focused on this and legitimate aerospace companies, not sort of your Amazons and Googles. It's Airbus, really. Embraer, others are looking at doing flying cars, right? So these will be certified, essentially certified light sport type aircraft that can navigate themselves with optionally piloted, basically, and then ultimately the pilot pops out of it. But that will be the stair-step plan towards doing this type of thing. And they're going to need places to land, right? And those places will need to be near communities. And I don't think it's going to be our major hubs. I think it's going to be smaller airports and heliports that are going to be the center of this type of aeronautical activity. I think that's something that gets me pretty excited. I'm hoping that gets you guys pretty excited as well. Okay, so cool. I did it faster than I hoped to, so that there's time for Q&A on this or anything else. It's not pavement, but go ahead, some questions. Go ahead, sir. Or there's a... You can just shout it out. See, if only the drone could deliver the microphone.
Just a quick question on safety, on drones, and I really don't know much about them and how they fly, but if it loses an engine, it looks like a lot of these drones have 4 rotors, 4 propellers, and let's say if you shell an engine and you lose the ability to rotate one, how does it fly on 3, or how does it fly on 1 if it has 2 propellers?
Yeah, so it does depend on the particular drone and how it flies in the event of failure. I think let me kind of step up for the higher level question, which is that it's almost an unanswerable question because the vast majority of these things are not certified to any type of standard at all. And so when we look at the failure rates on them, we just have to, the reason they can't fly over people is we have to assume that on any flight, that might be the flight when the drone falls out of the sky and injures someone. So I was on the FAA's Micro UAS Aviation Rulemaking Committee, which was basically the Flight Over People Rulemaking Committee. And what we realized was from using the FAA's standard risk assessment models, you have to assume because it's not certified that it's unknowable its failure rate, and it's unknowable what it will do in the event of failure, so you have to assume it fails. And then you have to say, is the injury that would be suffered by a person or the property damage, and does it reach a societal level of acceptance? So then they did a bunch of other tests, and they realized that you're not going to die if like a DJI Phantom falls out of the sky from 400 feet, even if it like hits you directly on the head where the landing gear goes down each side. You're still not going to die even in that like totally remote scenario. Maybe that's the one scenario where you would die, but it's so unlikely because it spins and tumbles that there's just deflection. But the big risk you're going to have is like serious laceration risks, like with like risks of blindness and a whole bunch of other stuff. There's a MITRE study and then a SHORE, which is the it's an FAA-sponsored UAS group called ASSURE out of the University of Mississippi. So what you might start to see then going forward with regard to this question of failure is that you're going to have this category of what we might call non-certified category of aircraft. You might call it toys, or you might just call it stuff that we can't predict anything about, which is going to have a limited set of operational parameters, basically your Part 107 rules, including the flight over people rules. And then you'll start to see things that will need to be either certified. So like an AeroVironment Puma at the high end of traditional certification, or you might see industry self-certification that gets approved by the administrator that says that this aircraft is reliable to a certain set of standards that we, the manufacturer, have tested to, and then be subject to audit. That's more of like a automobile DOT model. But I think that's the way we'll see this play out, so that we would actually be able to answer that question of failure rates and fail safes and whether it can fly on 1 propeller while, or 7 propellers while the other 4 are broken. So kind of a long answer to the question, but a way to think about the issue. Go ahead, sir.
You kind of answered part of my first question. You need to start doing categorical ratings of these drones. If you got the Predator that's a fixed wing coming in as opposed to the hobbyist, then you could take those hobbyists and geofence them to keep them out of the areas we don't want them in. When is that going to happen?
Yeah, so we did define in, I'm trying to think which, I'm on so many working groups. So I'm on the Drone Advisory Committee as well, and Task Group 2 of the Drone Advisory Committee is focused on access to airspace. And we actually did exactly this, but it was more around, so there were 2 variables, right? So nature and type of operation, so a Part 101 hobbyist operation versus a Part 107 operation, versus a Part 91 operation. Right? So this was kind of like the approach that they took. And then And then also looking at the nature of the aircraft, right? And then start to do this bucketing exercise so that everything isn't thrown into this category. Something like a Predator is already certified, right? So it has its own set of sort of categorical requirements and privileges associated with the aircraft. The bigger challenge now is the very diverse number of aircraft on this lower end of the spectrum, which are really SUAS operated below 400 feet. And we're now, the FAA, I say we, the FAA and industry are now trying to put together these types of criteria. So that's sort of, so I think you're right, and that's a trend line. The equities that the FAA is trying to balance are, if it's truly a low risk UAS, you know, it's 2 pounds, and it's, you know, it's not capable of getting more than, you know, a couple hundred feet from the operator. They don't want to over-regulate that lower end of the spectrum. And so that's why you're seeing sort of slow progress towards making these types of standards. Then with regard to the geofencing question, geofencing is actually pretty challenging because, first of all, the geofences can be worked around. Second of all, even a drone like a DJI Phantom, which is like a market-leading drone, has technological limitations that don't really allow the geofencing to function properly. So a limited number of data points that you can store on the drone to make the geofencing work. And so let's say you have 1,000 data points, you could do 1,000 point and radius circles, or you could do 250 rectangles, because the 250 rectangles require 4 points, right? And so as the number of points and the complexity of shapes go up, you'll start to see it more challenging for the drone manufacturers to accommodate the geofencing. It's why if you fly one of these DJIs, their geofencing doesn't mirror the controlled airspace shapes of our airports, but instead is like rough approximations using circles, and it's because there's a technological limitation on all of the drones. That is on the hardware of the drone, and that's when you put it on the hardware of the drone, it's the hardest part to change. Then within the software that controls the drone, you can put a lot more data points, but it has to be in the flight control system, so either the remote or the iPad or iPhone that's paired with it. But some people don't fly it with the iPhone or iPad that's paired with it. And then that still doesn't solve our dynamic geofencing requirement, like there's a fire popping up, or a military training route just went hot, or any of the other things that we might care about. The big one we're dealing with in Lance now is what happens when the runway configuration changes. So all of a sudden, you know, 200 feet on the south side of the airport was a great way to fly, right until the runway configuration changes, and now 200 feet on the south side of the airport is in approach. And so what do you do when that situation changes? All of that presupposes that the operator has some level of connectivity, which we would need a regulatory mandate to ensure they have connectivity, which then increases the cost of the BOM for the bill of materials for the manufacturer, and all of a sudden gets all of this pushback from the OEMs. Ultimately, I think then what has to happen is that you look at that framework where we think UTM is the future, and the FAA has to sort of take this crawl, walk, run approach where they say, we're not mandating that you're connected right now, but like 2021, you better be connected, right? So it starts to look like the ADS-B mandate. Not gonna force it on you now because everybody will freak out, but like we're gonna put you on a timeline to where you're gonna need to be connected, and then we kind of get to where you're at. Everything you said, though, I think is on a roadmap. The question is, where does it happen on the timeline? The Europeans are being far more aggressive on this, mandating geofencing and remote ID much more quickly. I'm good with long answers. I don't know how to do a short answer.
So,
go ahead, sir.
Folks, I'm afraid that's all the time we have. We've 20 minutes over on this. Give him a round of applause for his time. I know there are a lot more questions. If you can track him down here in a few minutes, and we're going right into the next session, so stay right where you are.
Greg, thanks very much. You'll appreciate this, being a former Army officer, have contributed to Wounded Warrior Project in your name. I need to thank the sponsors, South Coast Plaza, Morrison Marley, and Visit Huntington Beach. So thanks, Eric, for hijacking the session.